In the autumn of 1943, beneath paper banners urging citizens to buy war bonds and support our boys overseas, the town of Redfield, Georgia, gathered inside the church fellowship hall for what the mayor had advertised as a patriotic fundraising spectacle. Yet, what unfolded on the small wooden stage bore little resemblance to ordinary civic ceremony, because 22-year-old Anna Whitmore stood at its center in a simple white dress that had belonged to her late mother. Her hands clasped tightly before her as the town banker, Mr. Harlan Crow, now announced that her deceased father's unpaid loan would be settled through a war bride pledge, a humiliating arrangement disguised as voluntary sacrifice in which the highest financial contributor would claim her as a lawful wife under the justification that wartime unity required personal devotion. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Crow declared that Anna had agreed to the arrangement to preserve her family farm from seizure, though those closest to her knew the debt had ballooned suspiciously after her father's passing, and when Crow theatrically described her as a pure and loyal daughter of Redfield, the applause that followed felt strained, more obligated than celebratory. Anna's gaze remained steady despite the rising heat in her cheeks, because she understood that refusing outright would cost her the land that had sustained her family for generations. And in a town where sons were fighting abroad and rationing strained every household, questioning a banker's authority seemed dangerously close to questioning patriotism itself. Bids were announced and folded envelopes passed toward the stage, each pledge framed as noble generosity rather than transaction, until the door at the back of the hall opened and a U.S. Army staff sergeant stepped inside in dust-marked uniform, his presence drawing immediate attention as he approached the aisle without removing his cap. And when Crow called for final pledges, the sergeant placed a sealed envelope on the podium and stated calmly that he would cover the entire debt in full, on the condition that no marriage contract be signed, and that the farm remained solely in Anna Whitmore's name. The room fell into uneasy silence as Crow attempted to protest procedural expectations, insisting that the pledge required fulfillment of the bride agreement. But the sergeant countered that war bonds were intended to support American troops, not coerce American daughters, and as he placed official currency and bond certificates on the table, enough to extinguish the inflated loan outright, he turned to Anna not as claimant but as witness, cutting through the staged ritual by refusing to participate in its final act. In that deliberate gesture, paying the demanded sum, yet declining ownership, he dissolved the spectacle before it could bind her, leaving the crowd confronted not with scandal, but with the quiet exposure of a humiliation that had masqueraded as patriotism. Outside the church hall, where the hum of uneasy conversation lingered beneath the warm Georgia night, Anna followed the staff sergeant down the gravel path toward the edge of the courthouse square, her voice controlled but edged with disbelief as she demanded to know why a stranger would risk public hostility to interfere in what the town had framed as a lawful arrangement, and he introduced himself as Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves, explaining that he had come home on brief leave to visit his widowed aunt and had recognized the banker's tactics from similar schemes, investigated near other training towns, where inflated agricultural loans and patriotic pledges quietly transferred property from vulnerable families to financial intermediaries under the cover of wartime necessity. And Anna revealed that her father's original loan had been modest, intended only to repair storm damage to their cotton fields, yet after his sudden death the repayment schedule had been altered repeatedly, penalties added without clear documentation, and interest recalculated under clauses she had never been shown, leaving her with a debt that seemed designed less to be repaid than to justify seizure of the farm, unless she agreed to Crow's so-called bride pledge, a mechanism that would bind her legally to the highest bidder while preserving the banker's public image as benefactor. Reeves listened carefully and admitted that before entering the hall he had requested access to county bond records under the pretext of verifying donation eligibility for enlisted families. Discovering discrepancies between the bonds Crow claimed to have purchased for the war effort and the amounts officially recorded in federal ledgers, suggesting that portions of pledged funds were being diverted, while the bride auction served both as spectacle and distraction. and as the realization settled between them that the debt itself might have been engineered to trap her into compliance, Anna's humiliation transformed into anger sharpened by clarity, because what had appeared to be isolated misfortune now resembled calculated exploitation, targeting women whose husbands or fathers were absent at war. When Reeves asked whether she intended to accept quiet freedom and leave the matter buried, she lifted her chin with renewed steadiness and answered that paying the debt had freed her farm, but not the truth, and that if Crow had constructed this scheme around her, he had likely done the same to others less fortunate, a conclusion that shifted their encounter from rescue to alliance, rooted not in obligation, but in shared resolve to confront a corruption hidden behind flags and hymns. Anna did not return home immediately, because the gravel road leading back to her family farm felt different, now that the debt had been erased, yet the injustice remained exposed, and as Staff Sergeant Reeves walked beside her, beneath dim street lamps flickering against wartime blackout regulations, she admitted that at least 2 other young women in Redfield had faced similar pledge proposals after their fathers or husbands left for service, arrangements presented as honorable solutions to financial strain, but structured in a way that transferred land titles or business shares under marriage contracts heavily weighted toward the town banker's associates. Reeves absorbed the pattern quickly, recognizing that the supposed patriotism of the fundraiser had served to normalize coercion under the guise of sacrifice. And when Anna described how loan extensions were quietly modified once male family members departed for training camps, he realized that Crow's influence depended on the absence of those most likely to question the fine print, leaving women isolated in negotiations framed as civic duty rather than a legal obligation. Rather than retreat into private relief, Anna declared that allowing Crow to continue unchallenged would mean watching other women stand on the same stage in borrowed white dresses, while applause masked coercion, and she proposed gathering tangible proof, original loan contracts, altered interest schedules, and bond purchase records that could be compared against federal filings, to demonstrate that the debt inflation and bride pledge mechanism were coordinated rather than incidental. Reeves cautioned that confronting a banker with deep ties to the mayor and church board could trigger retaliation, particularly against a woman already publicly displayed as indebted. Yet Anna countered that the humiliation she endured had stripped away the fear of gossip, leaving only determination to prevent repetition, and she insisted that any action must be rooted in documentation rather than outrage, so that when presented before town authorities, the facts would outweigh sentiment. Reeves agreed to assist by requesting certified bond transaction summaries from the Regional Procurement Office under the authority granted to enlisted personnel reviewing family support claims, while Anna resolved to visit the county clerk the following morning to retrieve archived mortgage filings predating her father's illness. And as they parted near the edge of her property line, the alliance between them solidified not through promise of romance or obligation, but through mutual recognition that wartime patriotism should shield the vulnerable, not furnish cover for exploitation, marking the true beginning of a battle fought not with weapons but with records and resolve. The following morning, while Redfield resumed its routine beneath banners still praising sacrifice and unity, Anna entered the county clerk's office with a composure that concealed the urgency beneath her calm expression, requesting access to archived mortgage filings under the pretext of updating farm insurance records, and because clerks were accustomed to routine land verifications during wartime crop adjustments. Her inquiry raised little suspicion as she sifted through leather-bound ledgers that predated her father's illness, comparing original loan agreements against the revised repayment schedules issued months later. What she found confirmed her unease, for the initial contract carried a fixed interest clause consistent with regional standards, yet subsequent amendments, filed after her father's death, introduced penalty multipliers and administrative surcharges, lacking the required witness signatures, alterations quietly notarized by a clerk known to report directly to Mr. Crow, suggesting that procedural shortcuts had been taken when male oversight was absent. And as she copied reference numbers into a small notebook tucked within her handbag, She recognized that her family's debt had not merely grown through misfortune, but through deliberate recalibration designed to render repayment impossible without extraordinary means. Meanwhile, Staff Sergeant Reeves traveled to the neighboring county under the authority of reviewing wartime bond purchases connected to enlisted families. They are requesting certified summaries from the Regional Procurement Office and discovering discrepancies between the amounts Crow publicly announced during fundraisers and the figures officially transmitted to federal war bond accounts, gaps that implied diversion of pledged funds into private reserves, while the spectacle of bride pledges provided moral cover. By afternoon, they reconvened discreetly at Anna's farmhouse kitchen table, spreading documents across worn oak wood as sunlight filtered through lace curtains, and when Reeves aligned the altered mortgage amendments beside bond discrepancies, a pattern emerged linking inflated debts with underreported bond contributions, revealing that women pressured into marriage settlements had effectively been leveraged to mask financial shortfalls while transferring land assets to associates aligned with the banker's interests. The implications extended beyond personal injustice, because if bond pledges were misrepresented, federal oversight agencies would treat the matter not as local impropriety, but as wartime fraud. And as Anna traced the ink differences and notarization irregularities with steady fingers, she realized that exposing Crow's scheme would not only dismantle the bride coercion, but potentially unravel his standing within the broader war support network. Yet she also understood that confronting such influence required strategic timing and undeniable documentation, and as they folded the papers carefully into protective envelopes, their mission shifted from suspicion to substantiated evidence, preparing them for a confrontation that would demand not emotional appeal, but irrefutable proof placed before the same community that had applauded her humiliation only hours earlier. Armed with mortgage amendments, notarization inconsistencies, and certified war bond summaries, Anna and Staff Sergeant Reeves understood that quiet possession of proof would accomplish little unless it disrupted the banker's carefully maintained image of patriotic leadership. So rather than confront him privately, they chose to act at the next scheduled bond rally, where Crow planned to announce another pledge celebration, framed as community sacrifice. As townspeople gathered once more beneath bunting and hymns, Crow began praising Redfield's generosity and referencing Anna's supposed willingness to sacrifice for the war effort, unaware that she stood near the aisle, holding a leather folder thick with copies, and when he invited public applause for civic unity, Reeves stepped forward in uniform and formally requested permission to verify the bond totals publicly under federal oversight authority, a request that could not easily be dismissed without appearing defensive. Murmurs spread through the hall as Reeves read aloud the certified procurement figures that contradicted the sums Crow had proclaimed during earlier events, revealing shortfalls that could not be explained by clerical delay, and before Crow could redirect attention, Anna moved beside the podium and calmly presented the original mortgage contract, alongside the amended versions bearing altered interest rates and questionable notarization, explaining in clear, measured terms how the inflated debt had been used to justify her public bride pledge, a mechanism designed to transfer property under the illusion of patriotic necessity. The crowd's reaction shifted from curiosity to discomfort as the alignment between bond discrepancies and mortgage manipulations became apparent, and several farmers in attendance began whispering about their own revised loan statements, received after sons had left for training camps, realizing that what had been framed as isolated generosity might in fact represent systemic exploitation. Crow attempted to accuse Anna of fabricating documents, yet Reeves countered by identifying the official seals on the procurement summaries and offering to submit the entire file to federal auditors present in the neighboring county, an escalation that transformed the gathering from rally to reckoning. And as applause faltered into uneasy silence, the spectacle Crow once controlled fractured under the weight of verifiable records, marking the first public crack in a scheme that had thrived on secrecy and social pressure rather than legality. The public fracture of Crow's authority did not dissolve his influence overnight, and by the following morning, whispers had transformed into formal complaints filed against Anna, alleging defamation document theft, and moral impropriety, accusations calculated to shift attention away from financial discrepancies and back onto her character, because in a town where reputation carried more weight than ledgers, discrediting a woman could be more effective than disputing numbers. Deputies arrived at her farmhouse with a summons requiring her appearance before a special morality review convened by the church board and town council, a proceeding framed not as financial arbitration, but as examination of a conduct unbecoming a respectable daughter of Redfield, language that revealed the strategy clearly. If her virtue could be questioned, her evidence might be dismissed as vindictive fabrication rather than civic responsibility. Reeves, though technically an outsider in civilian proceedings, requested permission to attend as a witness under the justification that federal bond discrepancies involved military oversight. Yet he was warned discreetly that his presence might inflame tensions and invite accusations of coercion, an attempt to isolate Anna once more in a room structured to scrutinize her rather than the banker. When the hearing convened inside the same church hall that had hosted the bride spectacle, Crow positioned himself as wounded benefactor, claiming that Anna's father had relied upon his generosity for years, and that her public accusations represented ingratitude, compounded by emotional instability following grief, and a narrative designed to redirect sympathy toward himself, while casting her as impulsive and manipulated by outside influence. Anna stood alone at the center of the hall as murmurs swirled, yet instead of responding to the moral insinuations, she requested that the panel review the notarization dates on the amended mortgage contracts, calmly pointing out that 2 amendments bore signatures recorded on days when the listed witness was documented out of county, a factual inconsistency that forced the council members to lean forward rather than lean back. When Crow attempted to interrupt, Reeves requested formal acknowledgement of the procurement office seals attached to the bond summaries, reminding the panel that falsified wartime bond reporting constituted federal offense, not local misunderstanding. And as the room absorbed the weight of potential federal investigation, it became clear that retaliation had escalated beyond rumor into formal confrontation. Yet the strategy to shame Anna into silence was beginning to erode under the steadiness of documented proof. The special review convened that evening drew a larger crowd than any bond rally had managed because rumor travels faster than celebration, and townspeople who once applauded Anna's stage pledge now filled the pews to witness whether accusation or evidence would prevail, while Crow positioned himself at a long table near the front beside council members who appeared uneasy, yet unwilling to openly challenge his influence. The proceedings opened with formal language about protecting community morality and wartime unity, yet the undercurrent was unmistakable. If Anna could be painted as unstable or vindictive, the financial irregularities might be dismissed as spite rather than substance. When called to speak, Anna did not defend her virtue in emotional tones, nor did she attack Crow's character, but instead placed the original mortgage contract beside the amended versions, and asked the panel to observe the progression of interest increases that coincided precisely with the months following her father's death, highlighting the absence of proper witness validation on 2 amendments, and pointing out the mismatch between the ink aging on the signatures and the dates recorded, details subtle yet difficult to ignore. Murmurs quieted as council members examined the pages more closely, and when she finished, she stepped back rather than dramatize her position, allowing the documents themselves to occupy the center of the room. Reeves then addressed the panel with measured restraint, explaining that federal bond procurement summaries indicated reported contributions significantly lower than the amounts Crow had announced publicly, discrepancies that could not be attributed to clerical delay without additional explanation, and he clarified that his involvement was not personal, but procedural, because misreported bond funds during wartime carried consequences, extending beyond Redfield's boundaries. When one council member hesitantly asked Crow to reconcile the figures, the banker's composure faltered for the first time, and as he attempted to deflect attention toward Anna's alleged ingratitude, several farmers in attendance rose to question their own revised loan statements, realizing the pattern extended beyond a single family, And in that shifting atmosphere, the attempt to judge Anna's morality dissolved into scrutiny of financial conduct, transforming the hearing from trial of a woman's character into reckoning with a system that had relied on her silence. The turning point arrived not with a dramatic confession, but with paperwork carried in quietly by a deputy from the neighboring county who delivered notice that federal auditors had responded to the procurement discrepancies reported by Staff Sergeant Reeves and requested immediate review of Redfield's war bond accounts, a development that drained the color from Crow's face as council members realized the matter had crossed from local controversy into federal jurisdiction. When auditors began cross-referencing bond receipts with recorded deposits and comparing mortgage amendments against county notarization logs, irregularities multiplied rather than narrowed, revealing a pattern of diverted bond funds used to offset artificially inflated agricultural loans, thereby pressuring indebted families, particularly women whose husbands or fathers were serving, to enter pledge settlements that transferred land titles or secured long-term financial leverage under the guise of patriotic support. As the evidence accumulated, the moral framing that once shielded the scheme collapsed, because what had been marketed as sacrifice now resembled exploitation, masked by hymn and flag, and when confronted with mismatched transaction ledgers, bearing his authorization seal, Crow attempted to attribute errors to clerical oversight. Yet the synchronized timing of loan amendments and underreported bond deposits undermined the defense. The church hall that had once echoed with applause during Anna's humiliation now held a different silence, one sharpened by recognition rather than confusion. And when a formal suspension order was issued, pending charges of financial fraud and wartime misrepresentation, deputies stepped forward not toward Anna, but toward the banker who had orchestrated the spectacle. Anna did not speak triumphantly, nor did she seek public vindication, but as council members publicly acknowledged that her mortgage stood fully satisfied and that no lawful claim could bind her to any pledge agreement, the crowd's posture shifted visibly from skepticism to respect. Several women approached her afterward with quiet gratitude, admitting that they too had faced escalating debt notices tied to suggested marriage arrangements, and in that gathering of subdued acknowledgement, the humiliation that once sought to reduce her to transaction dissolved into restored dignity, because the same community that had witnessed her offered as a commodity now witnessed the exposure of the machinery behind it, transforming her from reluctant symbol of sacrifice into unwilling but resolute catalyst for accountability. When the war ended in 1945 and sons returned to Redfield beneath banners no longer shadowed by ration cards and telegram fear, the town carried quieter memories alongside its relief, among them the night a staged pledge had unraveled into public reckoning, and Anna Whitmore resumed tending her family farm with a steadier confidence born not from victory over a man, but from clarity about the system she had confronted. The federal investigation that followed Crow's suspension resulted in restitution orders for misallocated bond funds and revisions to county lending oversight procedures, measures that extended beyond Redfield and tightened scrutiny across neighboring towns, where similar debt escalations had surfaced once auditors looked closely. And though Anna declined invitations to speak at distant civic events, she quietly assisted other women in reviewing loan documents, teaching them to recognize interest recalculations and notarization irregularities that had once slipped unnoticed beneath polite assurances. Staff Sergeant Daniel Reeves returned to active duty after his leave concluded, yet correspondence between them continued with a tone defined less by romance than by mutual respect, because what bound them was not obligation born of payment, but shared refusal to let wartime patriotism be twisted into private leverage. When Reeves visited Redfield after his discharge, he found the church hall restored to ordinary gatherings rather than staged spectacle, and at a modest community ceremony marking improvements to local lending transparency. The mayor publicly acknowledged that vigilance on the Homefront had proven as vital to the war effort as enlistment, a statement met with measured applause rather than theatrical praise. Years later, when Anna walked past the courthouse square where she had once stood in borrowed white beneath watchful eyes, She remembered not the humiliation itself, but the moment the envelope of currency landed on the podium and redefined the transaction as exposure rather than surrender. And in the field she cultivated and the documents she helped neighbors review, the legacy of that confrontation endured quietly, affirming that in wartime America, freedom was preserved not only by those who fought abroad, but also by those who insisted that sacrifice never be weaponized against the very citizens it claimed to honor.